Well, welcome everybody. We're going to go ahead and get started. Is it me or you?
Well, we like to open and just ask anybody if they have anything they would like to add or contribute that kind of was placed on your heart in the past week since we met last time. So. All right.
All right, great.
Get started. We got to put it out there.
So I can start and then you, okay. So now we're going to venture into these basic emotions. We covered the feeling grid last week as kind of a base for us in trying to understand feelings and emotions. But for the next 6 weeks, we're going to delve into each particular one of those basic sets of emotions. And we want to understand these emotions fully, kind of as emotions. We want to understand them as they are used in the Bible and how God uses them, talks about them. And then what does that mean for us now? Like, how do we use those emotions? So that's kind of how we're going to frame our classes moving forward. Our hope is that for the first 20 minutes or so, we're going to try and understand emotion. So we're going to use the feeling grid. We're going to talk about these emotions and try and understand them specifically. You can describe the next part.
Oh, it's kind of zony.
Yes.
All right. So, you mean the slide?
Yeah, this one.
So we're gonna talk about hearing God's emotions. So we're gonna go into the Bible and we're gonna see how God is emotional and how he uses his anger. We're gonna talk a little bit about Jesus and how he uses his emotion, and then just compare that once we once we have that down and look at the role modeling of God.
Right. And then we want to open up the last part of our class to really discussion. So this is the opportunity to ask some questions about that emotion specifically, what questions you still have maybe, for us to, the more we ask, the more we understand it better. And then we also want to try and process or talk about those emotions. So Susan and I are going to be ready to talk about our own experiences with anger and talk about them and how we've come to use them and understand them better, not only just with each other, but with our children and in other relationships. So we want to hear from you guys so that we can also help you process through the right way to use those emotions with God and with other people. So Cain was angry and his face was downcast, right? Every time we ask our son where his sister is, he goes, "Am I my sister's keeper?" And we always say, "So what did you do? What'd you do?" So, right? We
actually just read that in the Bible with him, and as we read that, we looked over and James looked at us like, oh. Never mind, I'm not going to say that anymore.
That doesn't work. Anger starts early, right? In fact, I would argue that anger is the first emotion. It is primal. It is primary. It is the only way we have to protect ourselves. As infants, we have no other way of protecting ourselves. Baby giraffes, a couple hours, they're walking on and getting food and doing what they need to do. Babies, not so much. They just yell at us when they need something because they don't have any other way of protecting themselves. So anger becomes this initial tool to protect. And this need for protection continues. Anger is probably the most expressed emotion on the feeling grid. I know that everyone will probably love to say that they smile all the time and they're happy all of the time. Or, or they struggle with sadness and that's what they share with people. But actually anger is the most expressed emotion that we use all of the time. Why do you think that that is? This would be unmute your mic moment.
Because we are selfish creatures by nature, and anger is kind of an expression of not getting what we want.
right?
That's good.
That's exactly good. Any other ideas or thoughts?
Well, if anger protects, evidently we feel like we need to protect ourselves, and uh, there's a lot of dangerous things out there that are trying to take what we want or we have.
Right. So as we've developed, hopefully out of the infancy stage, what is it we're really protecting ourselves from now?
We all do it.
We all do it.
I
Right?
protect my ego,
Yeah.
Right?
my pride,
Sure.
hurt.
Right. Hurt.
Yeah. From
Right?
being hurt.
Exactly. If somebody hurts us, right, we tend to lash out back at them. We get angry back. So when somebody says something that hurts us, we sometimes hurt back out of anger.
And Brian,
Go ahead.
also, I think as we get older, we use anger to protect our closest relationships, our wives, our spouses, our children. And so we might get angry quicker if somebody is doing something, against them than our own selfishness. We kind of transition. I mean, we're all still selfish, but we also have like compound anger chances, more opportunities for anger than we did when we were just a child and concerned about ourselves.
Right.
That's true.
It's absolutely true. And we're kind of dancing around it. So basically the direct answer is we protect ourselves from other emotions. So the answer to this anger issue is in the feeling grid itself. Sadness and fear are on either side of anger. Nobody likes to feel sad, right? If we get hurt, that's part of sadness. So we tend to respond with anger because we don't like to feel sad. Raise your hand if you want to be in the sad line, right? Nobody wants to be in the sad line. One of my favorite funny stories about fear and protecting, right, is when I was in high school, my group of friends from church were my best gang of friends. And we were corny and we'd play hide and seek as full-grown adolescents in my friend Tanya's house. So we have giant people playing hide and seek in her living room. And so I was it, and I went down, and she has this pillar between her living room and the dining room. And I went to one side of the pillar, not knowing where Tanya was, but Tanya jumped to the other side of the pillar, and I didn't see her. She was trying to surprise me. And then I went back to the other side, and she jumped out the other way, and we totally missed each other. And then she jumped out again on the right side, and as she jumped up, I swung and punched her in the middle of her shoulder. And she fell to the ground, and I thought I hurt her, but she was laughing, so that's embarrassing. But I was afraid, and I protected myself with what we would call like some kind of behavior out of anger, right? I hit as a way of protecting because I was scared. So we use anger as a way to protect ourselves from sadness and fear. The problem is anger doesn't work. Anger, we try to protect ourselves with that anger, but anger is the opposite of empowerment on the feeling grid. It is not a powerful way to protect. If someone cuts me off while I'm driving and I use some choice words while I'm driving by myself, I'm sure that my anger is really teaching that other driver another lesson, right? He's learning a lot from me. That anger doesn't help them become better drivers. It doesn't make them more aware of me. Because in reality, the problem is that I was afraid of being hurt or injured or my damage to my vehicle. So I jumped to protection instead of acknowledge that fear. I'm trying to remember where my spot is. Sometimes, this isn't to say that, so I'd say this a lot in therapy, that there is really no reason for us to ever be angry. There isn't, because really what's underneath the anger is truly the issue. This isn't to say that anger doesn't happen. It definitely happens. I get angry, Susan gets angry, everybody gets angry. It happens.
Yeah, and I think some people have different levels of anger. Of the two of us, I'm the more susceptible, we'll say, to angry. I get angry faster. I get angry sooner. I am more verbal about it. I feel it sooner. Brian doesn't get he doesn't get as angry as often.
Well, my anger is different than hers.
Yeah.
And I'll talk about that in a second. Sometimes we believe that if we get angry because we believe that it protects us, we believe that it empowers us, even though it's the opposite of empowerment. We try to use that anger, but nobody ever wants to comfort someone who is angry. Ever. Has everybody seen the movie Elf? Right? There's a scene at the beginning and Buddy the Elf is going from the North Pole to New York to see his dad, and he sees a raccoon. And he goes, well, hey there, little guy. And the raccoon, hisses at him and he goes, ooh, somebody needs a hug. And he goes in for the hug to the rabid raccoon. Nobody except Buddy the Elf wants to comfort someone who is angry. I don't want to hug someone who's yelling. I don't want to befriend someone that ignores me. And I don't want to pet a rabid dog or a raccoon. We are using anger a lot and we don't even use it well. So I don't think it's reasonable to tell people to stop being angry, but I do think we need to pay attention to the fact that it happens so much. So let's talk about anger for a little bit. Here's our feeling wheel, or feeling grid, excuse me. So when we have this, we have anger. Everybody can see my mouse. Angry is our basic emotion. We have our 6 emotions that are more internally experienced, and then these are the third person expressed emotions. Now we have disgust, hateful, selfish, mad, hostile, and avoidant. You want to talk about your form of anger of these 6?
Which one is mine?
Oh my. Susan is disgusted.
Yeah, I get disgusted.
She becomes critical and sometimes indignant, and I'm saying this lovingly because I don't want any more feedback after this. Because mine tends to be avoidant, right? I tend to detach and get distant, but in doing so, as much as I think that that is not me being an angry person, that is me getting so angry that I don't want to deal with her, and she feels the anger because of my becoming so distant.
So his avoidant makes me more critical.
Right.
Like I get louder and I go find him, which is not helpful
Oh boy.
either.
Yeah, that doesn't
But
work.
the one thing that comes to mind, and we give a lot of examples because I think it's hard to find the anger in your life. Like we all know we get angry, but it's when we kind of go, oh, but I don't really ever get mad. And working with this and working together on this, I kind of realized, oh, I get mad more often than I think I do because I labeled it differently. So anytime, as our kids got older, anytime, I don't want my kids to bleed. I don't want them to get hurt. We haven't had broken bones. I kind of wish we could, so we get over that hump of being scared of getting to the ER or whatever in time. But so what I find myself doing when we're outside, or if we're all just going somewhere and one of them is trying to balance on some super high thing that they don't even need to be on or whatever, I start to get up. I start to get anxious. And then I'm thinking, what are you doing? You're going to hurt and I get anxious and I sound not nice. And I think I have a resting not nice face. So no matter what, they think I'm probably mad at them. And so I realized I had started thinking, why are you getting so anxious with them? Because I'm scared. I don't want them to get hurt. I mean, it comes directly from being a scared parent. So then I'm barking at them. And now I've just changed it to a joke. So I just go, okay, you have a savings account and your ER bill is going to be paid by you. I'm just letting you know. And so that's just my fun way of putting out the fact that I'm a little concerned about the kind of not so smart thing you're doing, but I need to allow them to do it. So I had to find a way to not have that anger. But that is anger. What child is going to look over and go, oh, okay, thanks, Mom. I'm not scared now. I'm going to go try it anyway. There's nothing really loving about that. It's out of love and it's from fear and scared, but it is exhibited as anger and unkind.
So if we think about our lives, and as we're going to continue to talk about this, I want you to think about even maybe the last time you were even just the slightest bit angry. And I'm willing to bet or put to the test that there is some level of underlying sadness or fear that is really the culprit in this situation. I would come home from work, having sit and listen to people talk all day long, having talked myself, and coming home ready to just kind of be calm and enjoy my family. And as I open the door, there's a sock on the ground, and then a shoe, and then a shirt, and then a pair of pants, then a sock and a shoe. Number one, who disrobes in that order? I don't understand this. Two,
It's not me.
who disrobes at the front door? Like who could even do this? My children just like, we're home, let's get comfortable, boom, and just rip their clothes off. And I am so frustrated that a common area, this is like written down in the Bible, that you can't make a mess in the common area. So I become frustrated with my children. But really what it is that I'm sad or disappointed that in this process, I am having to deal with more mess, more work to do when I get home. My space or area has been disrespected. I'm hurt that they know what they're supposed to do isn't following through. And if we think about it, any time we've interacted with our children, when we what were you thinking, right? Evidence to the fact that they weren't thinking. So when we ask that question, we're asking in anger, but really what it is they've done something that totally scared us, or totally hurt us, lost trust with us. And that's the important thing to remember, is that this anger we're expressing, it doesn't work. Anger doesn't work.
Any questions about the grid or any examples from your side of the camera?
I have a question. As I'm looking at the grid, Susan, you're at one end, and Brian, you're at the total other end. Does that make it easier to get along, or would it be easier if one was discussed and the other was hateful, or is there any relation at all?
I think that they actually work against each other. To me, it feels, because that's why I kind of said he's avoidant. So it makes it harder for me, because being critical and being disgusted. So for me, and it might just be kind of how we react to stuff, but they are on opposite sides, so they are quite different. It's a good question. It feels like it to me.
Something I didn't cover because it would have been an overwhelming, I think, a little bit in covering the feeling grid, is that even though this is in a spectrum from up to down, right? We have a spectrum of feelings. These emotions are also complementary. So disgust and critical, right, kind of is that opposite end of spectrum of avoidant and detached. So they tend to complement each other. And I think that works between sadness and fear as well. And as we move closer to the opposites on the upset side, those tend to complement each other. So anxiety and anxiousness tends to complement apathy and numbness. So I think that there is a complementary level where these two sometimes can go hand in hand, just as much as I think hostility and hateful go together, and mad and selfish go together. And if I'm working with a client, again, I look at the spectrum of each one, what's on the either side of it, but I also look for that complementary emotion. So that is a good point.
So you're saying opposite what I said.
A little bit.
Okay, so we think the opposite. No.
I mean, they complement each other in the sense that I think that they go together, but they tend to hinder
each other.
hinder the function. I agree with that
Yeah.
part.
Because if you're critical, you're not really avoidant.
And it makes me want to avoid any kind of
Yeah.
criticism. And so my tendency to respond anger wise, similar in the marriage retreat, how do you respond? We had the Bob the Builder method, right?
Yeah,
Or the
That's what I was going to say.
Susan is definitely a rear admiral who is commanding several ships and comes after and has her hand on the fire button. So for me, I tend to vacillate between a lot of them, but anger-wise, I'm a little more with.
The sweeper, is that the sweeper, Sean? Right? Yeah.
Yes.
So
Brian and Susan?
Yeah.
I have a comment on that because Jan and I have some opposites, like you're the same one that y'all are talking about. So I think you're both right. I know I'm being there politically correct, but it is we have a higher red flag for those two things, but because over the time of our marriage, all 15 years, us almost 31, it has helped us be better at those extremes than if we had not had the opposite in our mate, because God knew that we needed that kind of tempering in our emotions, even though we may not have known it at the time, but it helps us be more, when we're not in the angry moment, we're more cognizant that that might get us there. So therefore we arrive there less often because we know it.
and if we are together and frustrated at someone or something else outside of us in our relationship, it does help, because I typically am stronger when he is weaker. And then when he is stronger, that's when I have no words and I can't figure out what to do. And his calmness comes in and can complement.
Right. And what we're going to get to here in a minute of how to use anger is that it's deeper than this. The anger, again, we have it and we use it, but it doesn't work. And that's the theme. Anger doesn't work.
Right.
So if you walk away from everything tonight, anger doesn't work.
But it's not going to go away.
It doesn't go away.
It's not going to go away. And we'll kind of talk about that in relationship to sin, because Brian said, we've kind of not argued about this, but
I've been right about
some of it.
some.
No. But he said earlier, what did you say earlier today? He's like, people don't get relief from being angry. And I'm like,
Well,
I do. Like, I can be angry and go, oh, that feels much better. That doesn't mean it's better. But so that's one of those, it's on a continuum if you kind of think about it. Anger's not going to go away, but we need to figure out how to find it, control it quickly, and figure out what's underneath it. So, which is what we're gonna get to in the last 20 minutes.
Here's yours.
All right, so I can't think about that. So this is hearing God's emotion. So we have figured out that we have talked about it. Anger doesn't work. It pretty much hurts. But how do we know this? In the Bible. So we're going to go to the Bible and find stuff in the Bible. The Old Testament is full of examples. Are you want me to read that first?
Yes.
Okay. I'm sorry.
I do the slides. She does the writing. So we're out of sync here a little bit.
All right. So I found this verse and I loved it. And we've heard parts of it before, but reading it as we were talking about anger today and righteous and God, it just fit. So James 1:19-21 is, my dear brothers and sisters, take note of this. Everyone should be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to become angry, because human anger does not produce the righteousness that God desires. Therefore, get rid of all moral filth and evil that is so prevalent, and humbly accept the word planted in you, which can save you. So, to me, this separates human and God. We do get angry, but we're not supposed to, and he tells us not to get angry. He's allowed to be angry because he's God, and there is righteousness in his anger when he has it. And so that's our job, to find that in the Bible and work through that and understand it and acknowledge that there's anger in the Bible. So God uses anger. So let's look at some areas. God uses anger throughout the Old Testament. And in Exodus Exodus 32, 10 through 14. I chose some verses that just kind of, as we read through the Bible periodically, I'm like, oh, I remember this or I remember that. So there's a lot, but these are the ones I chose. For one, they're pretty bad. They're pretty angry. So I thought I'd go with the extreme anger. But Exodus 32, 10 through 14. Now, therefore, let me alone that my wrath may burn hot against them and I may consume them in order that I may make a great nation of you. This is God talking to Moses when Moses goes up on the mountain and he's like, no, I can't, I'm not going to mess with it. Basically, God's like, no, they keep breaking the rules. They need to die. I'm going to burn them, be rid of them. And Moses, so God has anger. He's allowed. It's righteous anger. And that's the part I want to pull out with using this verse. But what I like after that is in, did you just do 10 through?
Yeah.
Okay.
In the very next verse.
And then in the very next verse, Moses implored with the Lord. He said in the next verse, he's like, please change your mind. Please, let's try this again. It doesn't work out very well, by the way, as you read through the rest of the chapter. But God listens to him. So what I think is interesting is that Moses doesn't react back with anger, because we don't react with anger to a righteous God's anger. So I just like that Moses, he implores like, please, Lord, please don't do this. So he asks God not to, and God listens to him.
I'm going to kind of hammer that home a little bit. When we hear anger from somebody else, we tend to respond with anger. But we have looked throughout the Bible to find when God is angry, that people respond back with their own anger to God. And that doesn't happen.
Well, this is a new concept. We haven't found it. So if you've seen it, tell us. But it just doesn't seem to be, oh, really, I'll throw a thunderbolt back. That doesn't.
Right. Like, oh, okay.
Or you're not alive anymore. So
it's not that we don't have anger with God or that's not present in the Bible. I'm saying that when God expresses anger to his people, that those people respond back with their own anger. So it's different because of that relationship of viewing God as righteous. We as people see him as righteous. That communication between God and people is different than what it is between person to person.
So typically when God is angry, we fear him. When you'll see Jesus gets angry a couple times, and that's controversial whether or not it's anger or just he raises his voice, we still fear him. But when man gets angry in the Bible, man gets angry back. So that we just kind of notice that, and I think that's pretty important to look at and interesting. All right, so Ezekiel is the other one that I did, which Ezekiel 7, the title of the chapter is The Day of the Wrath of the Lord. Like, that cannot work out very well, like at all.
Not a good day.
Now, with Ezekiel, this is a really cool book. So the Bible Project is really cool because you can listen to it, talk about it, and he kind of tells you. Because as I read it and then I went and listened to it, I'm like, he's kind of told to act out stuff. He's a prophet. God is telling him and giving him visions and saying, this is what is going to happen. And this is what he says in Ezekiel 7 is going to happen. The wrath of God is going to come down on you. And in 8 is where you see his anger put out. Now I will soon pour my wrath upon you and spend my anger against you and judge you according to your way. And I will punish you for all your abominations. So Jerusalem is going to fall, I think, after this. This is after Ezra. So he is angry again and again and again. So it's seen over and over again because the Israelites turn away from God constantly and he just keeps wanting them not to, but they do. So he gets angry. I want to cover a couple places where Jesus raises his voice or gets angry. So the first one is Mark 11, 15, 19. I didn't know which one you said first. There's a space between 15 and 19. So it's verses 15 through 19. And they came to Jerusalem, and he entered the temple and began to drive out those who sold and those who bought in the temple. And he overturned the tables of the money changers and the seats of those who sold pigeons, and he would not allow anyone to carry anything through the temple. And he was teaching them and saying to them, it is not written, my house shall be called, it is not written, my house shall be called a house of prayer for all the nations. But you have made it a den of robbers. So how many of y'all have heard this just through church and growing up? And yeah, it's like, oh, he got angry.
Right.
It doesn't say angry in there, but I'm just going to call it, you're not allowed to turn tables and throw them and fling them without being told you're kind of angry or upset. So whether or not he was just making his point, as you read further in Mark, I think it's through to, I don't know which one it was through, but further down a couple verses, if you look at it, it doesn't say that people were scared of him. It says the Pharisees and the scribes feared him.
And wanted to destroy him because of that.
And so as they feared him, they didn't fear him. They feared everybody loved him. So they were in fear of everybody wanting to hear more, wanting to
Right.
hear the teaching and wanting to hear. So there was no anger back at him. The Pharisees and scribes just knew they were angry at him and didn't like him. So I just think that's very interesting.
So that fits the model that when God is angry, people don't respond back with anger to his anger. The people fell in love with him, and that love that they had for God is what the Pharisees and scribes feared, is his popularity.
So that could put it into the realm of a righteous anger from God. Do y'all see kind of where that connection is happening? That's kind of where I put it. I don't know. That was interesting to kind of read. So then the second one I want to point out is, when Peter speaks, "Get behind me, Satan." Well, that doesn't sound very joyful either. He sounds upset, like he raises his voice. When Peter speaks up and rebukes Jesus' plan, that is from God, and Jesus says, "Get behind me, Satan." It's in Matthew 16:23. Well, you're either for God or you're against God. And Peter kind of went against, in that moment, Peter was against what Jesus was saying was meant to happen and what was going to happen. And this is also after so many times the apostles have seen miracle after miracle after miracle. And he still says, no, Jesus, this is what you need to do. And so he's like, "Get behind me, Satan." Therefore, he was an adversary at that moment, and Jesus spoke up. I think Jesus was tired at that time too, because he had been through a lot at this time, and it was time for him to go and be crucified. So he had a lot on his plate. But I mean, he also didn't get super crazy angry, and he could have. And that's kind of what we want to move into. He didn't, he could have done anything he wanted with anger, with anything, because he is God, right? But that's where the shift is. So this is where the shift is into the New Testament.
The Old Testament, again, is there are tons of examples of anger from God. And we have a shift in the New Testament where we see less expression of anger, because what we get from is Jesus. We get Jesus in the New Testament, and Jesus brings forgiveness. Forgiveness is the key aspect and point of the New Testament. It's the only thing God can do, and that's what Jesus does. It's what he's rebuked for by others, but it's what he is because he is God. So God moves away from using anger as a way to communicate and uses forgiveness. Well, that's important because what's the definition of forgive?
Anybody? Without Googling it.
Nobody? Stop being angry with. That is the Merriam-Webster's definition of forgive, to stop being angry with. This is a gigantic shift in the way that God addresses his people. He addresses us with forgiveness more than anger. Anger is not really in the toolbox of Jesus. He brings forgiveness and stops using the anger that God so often used. He becomes more powerful and by his not being angry. When we think about Jesus, he becomes more empowered the less angry he becomes. His ability to not get angry at all the things that he has tried with and tested with, and he continues to stay at a place he becomes more empowered. They lose their power. They cannot trick him. They cannot fool him. They're trying to get him to be angry, and it doesn't work. And he becomes more empowered because of that.
Hey, Brian, I was wondering, or for you guys, just a thought, because when you first asked that, of course, where I have a tendency of going is more of the releasing, which I wondered if this could fit into what you guys are saying, like releasing the reason for anger. Does that fit with what you're saying here?
Releasing the reason for anger.
For why I'm angry or why I'm in that place. So, I mean, it's kind of, to me, it's kind of saying the same thing. Stop being angry with and releasing the reason for being angry. But that's how I've heard it before, and that's how I kind of walk through that.
Similar. I don't want to say release the reason that we're angry, because back to the principle that anger is there to protect. And we're protecting ourselves from another emotion, either sadness or fear. So the reason we're angry is because we're sad or scared. So I wouldn't say releasing the reason we're angry. We have to release anger completely. And we have to pay attention to the sadness and the fear. Does that make sense?
So I think it's connected, and we talked about this earlier with behaviors. And I think the release is almost like the releasing of the behavior that hurt me, or releasing what happened to me. But I think you're saying, Brian's thinking, you don't have to release the hurt. The hurt's where you're going to heal. The sadness is where you need to be so you can heal.
Right.
But you can't get to the sadness or being scared or fear until you stop being angry. And I think the release kind of comes with that.
Right.
So I see it fitting, and it's all connected.
Right. Slight distinction.
Yeah.
So how do we use anger? Well, it's difficult. It is difficult because, again, we're saying that really there's no reason to be angry. We need to pay attention to what's underneath that anger, the sadness or fear. But anger happens. And so how do we do this? It's kind of complicated, but it's not at the same time. So Psalm 44 is a great psalm where we get an instance of anger. The Psalms provide excellent ways for us to look into how we communicate with God. Kelly started us off with this last Sunday. They have messages of praise, thanksgiving, sadness. They have joy and anger. And in Psalm 44, 23 through 24. So we go into the psalm quite a bit, and then we get this moment where, with exclamation points, I don't have it on here because I was running out of time, but I will read it aloud to you. It says, "Awake, Lord, why do you sleep? Rouse yourself. Do not reject us forever. Why do you hide your face and forget our misery and oppression?" I only read this with anger because they are feeling other things, though. The thing is God wants to hear our anger. God has no problem with us being angry. And God, similar to what we talked about earlier, and Susan brought up this idea that when God is angry with us, we don't respond with anger back toward God. It works the other way too. When we express our anger with God, the fact that we have anger, God does not respond with anger with us. He never gets mad at us for being mad at him. Because this entire psalm is really about misery and oppression. They are completely withdrawn, completely sad. For 23 verses, we lead up to the fact that they are struggling with where they are, and they feel abandoned, they feel rejected, They are scared of what comes next because God is not with them. They are unsure of where he is. Where has he been? We've probably all been in this situation. Where the heck are you, God? Why is all this happening to us? Those statements are out of anger and frustration, his lack of implementation in our lives, his lack of evidence or appearance when we need him, because we're calling upon him, and we're allowed to be angry. This psalm has so much sadness. I lost my place. Hang on one second. The important thing is that we need to express this anger with God. We share our feelings with God, even anger, because God wants to listen. God is talking about anger leads to talking about our sadness and fear. The psalm continues where they have this moment and buildup of sadness for 23 verses. Then you hear this moment of frustration and they're like, holy cow, where are you? And then they go back into their sadness because that is the point. The point is emotionally as people and as people talk to God, we can express our anger. And in doing so, being aware of the fact that we're angry, not just being angry, but being aware of it, talking about it, we can get to a place where we're also talking about our sadness and fear, which is the important part. You have something? Okay.
So thinking of vertical and horizontal, which we always kind of bring up, is where is anger allowed? It's mostly, I say mostly because it happens horizontal, but it's allowed to be vertical.
Right.
We're not supposed to stay in it, but God understands it. And if you're going to be mad or angry, he's okay with it as long as it's vertical. It's not, I don't know if we should say this, but it is a sin to take your anger horizontal. So it is a sin for me to yell at my kid and say, what are you thinking walking on that? You're going to fall and hurt yourself. You know, that's kind of a sinful way of talking. I'm going to put sin with that because anger's not helping. It's getting in the way of my being loving and kind to my child. Or barking and getting upset at Brian and protecting myself with anger is horizontal. Or anybody
right.
that you see. But if you go vertical first, it's going to disappear before you go horizontal. And that's what I've learned to do because I'm a good angry person sometimes. I'm like, just walk with it, talk to God about it, go vertical with it, and then go for a long run, and then I'm not mad anymore.
Right. When we make ourselves vertical with that, God becomes sympathetic to our anger. So remember the difference between empathy and sympathy. Sympathy is the shared experience of emotion. When we are vertical with our anger, God is sympathetic to it. He's like, yes, I'm angry too. I'm angry too. I know that anger. I've been that anger. God knows what it's like to be forgotten. He knows what it likes to feel abandoned. He sits with us in our anger. He wants us to bring our anger with him so that we can understand his anger, his righteous anger. So that was excellent for bringing the vertical part back up. That was awesome. That was ad-libbed, noted, star for Susan. When we start talking about our anger with God, it allows us to get to the heart of the problem, that sadness, that fear, that loneliness. And in doing so, and talking about your getting angry at God because where is he? You're talking to God. You're no longer lonely. You're finding answers there. This is how God can speak to us and respond in comfort and be compassionate to our words. Okay. The more we acknowledge, share, and discuss our anger with God and others, the greater the likelihood of using the emotions that work, like sadness and fear. So I'm going to use Kelly and Sarah since they brought it up last week. Kelly brought up his example of thinking he is not mad, just frustrated. which is still angry. But he acknowledged that he was not acting angry. He was having a moment of anger. And I'm willing to bet, they didn't talk about this, but I'm willing to bet that even talking about the fact that he was frustrated, that he was working through that frustration by mentioning it, just putting it on the table, that this led to greater communication. This led to an opportunity for Sarah to comfort, to be able to get to the heart of either sadness or fear that was probably underlying. And they're shaking their heads. So that's good for me to know that that's accurate. Now, God simply, I already did that part. Okay. So now we have a few questions, but also wanted to see if you all, this is our time for discussion and questions about anger. So Susan alluded to this question. I'll ask it for everybody. Is anger cathartic?
Meaning it helps you feel, took off some of the weight because I got to be angry at somebody.
By the way, we looked up cathartic in the dictionary, and the noun cathartic is when you release something from your bowels. So a cleansing from the bowels. So, you know, I thought that was pretty pertinent for today's discussion.
So cathartic or not.
What do y'all think? Is anger cathartic?
For some of you, it might be the opposite. It actually might be like, oh my gosh, it makes me want to throw up to have to be angry at somebody.
I'll start it off. My way, Sarah and I were just talking about this, my way of expressing anger is avoidance, withdrawal, and I've never thought about it, but I assume that one of the reasons that I express my anger in that way is that it helps me get over it. If I go for a run, or if I let some time pass, then the anger dissipates. So I don't know whether that would be classified as cathartic or not.
Yeah.
But anyway, that's just kind of something that I'm exploring now that you brought it up.
I do know that running is a part of a piece of the puzzle of Kelly on his whole anger thing, emotions.
It works.
Well, and emotions are physical, so as well, we experience them. They're visible to others. So being able to do something physical is something that can help with that release of anger. The only question I would have is, are you still getting to the bottom of your sadness or fear that brought on the anger? That would be the next question.
Yeah, well, I think, of course, you know, we've been together a while. And so, of course, we have grown in this area of being able to step away from that we probably weren't able to do in our first, 5 or 10 years of marriage. So I would say, yeah, Kelly is becoming more connected and more expressive in his feelings. And we're both really proud of that.
Yeah. Good.
Yeah, but it takes a while. It's not like, we've been married for 40 something years. So finally, we're getting each other, better all the time.
Good.
So Jan and I were discussing it a little while it was muted, and same thing with the opposites is that when we were first married, I was more like my dad and wanted to avoid it and be quiet about the anger, and she was much quicker to express it. So that didn't work real well in the first year or so. But then we wish we'd had this class back then, but we learned from experience that and what she was saying is it the anger expression makes her feel good at the moment, and even for a few moments after, but say 30 minutes or an hour to not so much. Well, the opposite would happen where if I sat on my anger in about an hour or two, I'd probably want to, revisit it. So doing both things, but in a more holy way, in a spirit-led way, I think is what God really wanted us to do. But what we typically, we bury it in a hole in the backyard in the jar instead of investing it for God to grow from the experience. And so that's the more we can make the experience be a growing thing and have that attitude before, during, and after, then the better the anger will have resulted in a good thing, instead of us ignoring it. And that's the part, is I think we ignore it because it's easy, and then sometimes we ignore it because we forget, but then we get double angry when we remember it again 2 or 3 days later.
And I think that has a lot to do with not working through that underlying feeling. So you have to start all over it. You have to start over again, and because the anger does pop in. But that, Sean, with what you said about releasing, I kind of kept thinking of the word release while you were talking about that. Not Kevin, right?
Yep.
Yeah, Kevin. But it's almost just release the anger. Like you have to kind of release. To me, it sounds like releasing the anger, like generally. Is that similar to kind of what you were asking? Yes. Sorry.
Yes, I didn't know if you were talking to Kevin or not. Yeah, because part of it is, it's not, I connect with you 100%. It's not necessarily a releasing the whys,
Right.
sadness, the hurts, the traumas that are, that happens, within us. So yeah, I totally connect with you there. But it's what we do with that. It's how that,
Yes.
I think that's how it all rumbles up. There's a different way and format in which it needs to come out that becomes more godly, and that is godly versus non. So
Right.
yeah.
I wanted to ask everybody, because really this is feelings and emotion and lamenting and anger especially you're kind of shied away from. They're shied away from, I think, when we talk about Jesus and Bible studies and we talk about our faith. But does anybody have a reaction about just us talking about anger and saying, yeah, you can be angry and tell God that you're angry? Like, is that I guess it's just an overall question of like, what's your reaction to us just talking about anger?
Are we?
You're on.
Yeah, I feel like a lot of messages that we give to each other, and maybe at church, is that we're not allowed to be angry. And so I think some of the feedback that Kelly's gotten from the sermon on it is that, oh, it's okay. God can handle it. I can be angry, to to have feelings.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's, I think, that's part of it. I think we're giving up a message about this, but I love that you're talking about this, because God can handle it. And when people are in mourning, or, all the stages of mourning, anger is one of them. It's just something you need to work through.
Right.
So,
Cool. Thank you. It's good to hear.
Any other questions?
Well, just to process, and actually, Sid Walker kind of mentioned a question in the chat, and so he was talking about James 1, and just processing, because I've always kind of walked through the slow to anger, right? The notion, and then maybe an example like Proverbs 22:24, do not associate with one easily angered, right? So we can often go to that. It doesn't say no to anger, it just says slow to anger.
Right.
Right.
And And so that's I've just been processing, you know, a lot of that. I love this discussion and how to better understand these things as we kind of walk through it.
Yeah, right when you said that, I was like, he does say slow to anger. So we're right, anger exists.
In Ephesians
you know.
6:4, fathers, do not exasperate your children. Right? So, I mean,
It means we're going
it means we do, and we need to recognize that creates a hostile relationship between father and son, father and mother and daughter. The exasperation happens, and that's the warning is to be careful when it happens. And again, I think that parallels really with the whole getting horizontal with our anger versus being able to be vertical with our anger. Again, anger doesn't work. It's not. Ultimately, it doesn't really solve anything with God. When we get to our sadness and our fear, now we're working through the problem, and that's where God becomes compassionate.
Well, and that actually makes me think, what is your first, like, whenever I have a client who lost her child, and we deal a lot with faith. We don't talk about our faith. And so my question one time was, when you talk about being, you know, you're Catholic, do you talk to God? Oh, I'm mad at him. And I'm like, I have an in. I'm in. Like, you are something at God, and that's good. So, and it usually is mad or angry, or it's more of a hostile, that's where we start. And so it's, you know, yes, slow to anger, but that anger's there. And so that gives us a shoe in. I'm like, okay, we're connected. We're talking about God.
Right.
I'd rather you be mad at him than done with him.
Right.
And that usually is what we start with.
Right. Being mad means there's a connection still.
Yeah.
Remember, emotions connect. So if you're mad, then you're connected. If you want to connect, you got to talk about it.
Ryan and Susan,
Go ahead. Yeah, Kevin.
were y'all going to bring up the scripture about not going to bed angry?
We don't like
We're going to talk about that in another class.
I think we talked about it.
Because I remember in the marriage retreat, y'all had some good wisdom.
Oh,
Right.
yeah.
And that's fair. And
I'll let any of them answer that.
we didn't really want to use too many things. We were trying to make sure, again, to me, that verse, if everyone's familiar with it, you know, people have said, don't go to bed angry. And I don't think I think that that's sometimes an unrealistic expectation. But again, if we're paying attention to the fact that we're not going to use anger because it doesn't work, I think if you're going to bed angry, you're going to have a difficult time falling asleep. And forgiveness is about stopping being angry. So I think the idea and the message that I read deeper into that is that we should not go to bed angry, but it does not mean that we can go to bed still hurt or rejected or lonely or all of those things. And if we're paying attention, because the important part here is, like we talked about on Sunday, is these emotions are there, and we should recognize them and put them out there.
Well, I thought what I was thinking is why I asked, you know, the question tongue in cheek there was, because you're giving a strategy, and you did at the marriage retreat too, to concentrate, you know, on the vertical, especially like right before you go to bed, which might be a time when there might be some feelings that are coupled with other feelings than just anger. And
Right.
so the mutual delaying on purpose to discuss and resolve resolution can happen after bedtime if anger is dropped at bedtime.
Right.
You know,
Well, and
you
what
get
is
to that anger part and say, okay, we're not going to be angry anymore, but we will resolve to address the deeper things involved with this issue, and we'll do it when we're well rested and fed. And
Sure.
right? So I just always like, what does go to bed mean? Like,
Right.
maybe we could talk about if that actually just means, okay, I'm gonna put my pajamas on, I'm gonna brush my teeth, I'm gonna go to bed. Like, it could mean,
right.
like, more generally, you know, more poetically, don't put your relationship to bed with
Mhm.
anger. Get through it first. And so, yeah, it's a tricky verse.
So we're running toward the end of our time, and I was going to give kind of a short example of our lives where Susan and I are using anger better. Because again, I think we haven't always used anger very well with each other or around others. And so this isn't particularly related to us, between us, but I think it's a good example of how we can use anger. When anger starts to happen, we can feel it from each other. We start to notice it, and what I've noticed is the few times that I have started to report my anger to Susan, when it's not related to her, it's easier for sure. But it starts to, I am getting so frustrated right now. There tends to be an investigation that follows. What is it you're angry about? Like this, and she's trying to understand it. And then we get to the bottom of what my anger is about. Sometimes it's like somebody said earlier, you know, it's my own ego. Sometimes I'm just not getting what I want. Sometimes it's that I'm just irritated and you need to stop this anger business because everyone's going to feel it and no one's going to like you in a minute. There's not this hangry thing or anything like that. But when I start to put out there that my anger is building, my anger is developing, it allows Susan to respond to it in a way that helps me understand myself better. It's not that I'm getting angry with her. It's not that I actually yell at anybody. It's that I start to recognize that it's happening. And when I talk about the fact that it's happening, I get some feedback and some investigation and some help along the way to help me really understand what's really underneath it, sadness, fear, and then get to the bottom of that and then really work through that problem.
So it's the connecting through the feeling
Right.
to understanding where the other one is. Because an angry person that you have no idea what they're thinking is a scary person. And if you compare that to an angry person who is saying, I am so angry that this is happening to me, they're connecting with you. So you can, it's just like that. I'm angry at God. You're connecting, he knows, and you're going to start communicating. So you can communicate with one another. And it also gives you a place to be protective of them if they're angry, because you know that they're more than angry, they're hurt and sad. So I had a supervisor tell me my first practicum back in 1998 when in counseling, and he said, you know, every single person you see who is mean, angry, or unkind to you is hurting somewhere deep inside. And I just always kept that with me and hoped people thought that about me too. I'm just kidding, but it's so true. Underneath it, someone's hurting. So yeah. And if you can just talk your anger to each other, that's when I think horizontally it's okay. If you're talking about it and you're not being it at the person. I got in trouble one time in one of our fights. I said, you're acting like a blank. And he looked at me and goes, you called me a blank? And I'm like, no. You're just acting like one. Those are very different. And he's like,
you can choose to
no,
stop. And I was like, oh my gosh.
So, but in the sense of talking about your anger, not being angry, two different things to where you could actually probably control it from getting out of hand or someone gets hurt. So.
Any other questions before we sign off today?
Well, the most I was dealing with anger, I can say, is when I was married to an abusive man. And he was very jealous, controlling, and he would lash out at me in anger. And at first, I would respond in fear. I would just try to change whatever I could so that he wouldn't be angry anymore. And then I eventually kind of snapped and started yelling back at him, started calling, cussing at him too. And it just ended up being like this unsustainable. He was not safe anymore because the way he would get so angry, fly into a rage, I never knew what he was going to do. So we weren't able to talk about it in a healthy way. You know, we tried going to counseling. It was always, everything was my fault no matter what, you know. So it was, I felt like I dealt more with anger in that short marriage than any other point in my life.
Right. And you probably, I think there was probably more than just anger on his side. And that is one of those examples of talking through your anger is probably not going to work. And it sounds like you got out of something not great.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. And so that is one of the exceptions to where it might not help to sit and talk through because one of you, which is him, not capable of doing what you're trying to do.
Right.
So sounds like he was all horizontal and you were trying to be vertical.
Just trying to work through it, and it just wasn't sustainable, you know, wasn't safe. So.
Yeah, I'm listening to something.
Yes.
I don't think that was enough.
Oh, is that enough for us? Okay.
Thank you for sharing that, Laura.
Thank you, Laura. Well, before we go, I'm going to pray for us and our anger this week or tomorrow, because it's going to happen, right? But that we can work through that with God and others productively. Heavenly Father, thank you so much for just being with us, being in understanding our anger that we have with others, to understanding our anger that we have with you at times. Lord, we're so thankful that you listen to us, that you sit beside us and you come beside us with your own feelings and you let us know them too. You've written such a wonderful way of connecting with you. And Lord, if sometimes we need to be angry to connect with you, then Lord, let it be. And Lord, we're so thankful that you can do that. Lord, help us to understand that our anger doesn't work. It's not the end. It's not the only thing there. And that we can come to understand and communicate other ways to connect with you and protect ourselves in these times. Lord, protect over and watch over these people in our group and in our church and in this world as we continue to deal with difficult times. Bless us and nourish us in your name. Amen.
Amen. Thank you for being in our group again.
Thank you for all your hard preparation work and everybody being so transparent, especially you, Laura. That was
Appreciate it very much. Lord.
Yeah. That's what did a good class.
was.
We'll see you all
Thank you.
next week.
Thank you, guys.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.